Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the last time I say good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And what a day it's been. There is a prize for anybody who's been to every single talk. Who has been to every single talk? No, you don't count. Yay, look at that. That is commitment for you. Thank you very, very much indeed. And so, in my true Ronnie's phrase, we have coming to the last of a very busy programme, but last and not least, it is the magic that is William Morris and Karen Livingstone. So Karen and I actually do know each other. We both worked at 3&A together many moons ago, and things have our lives have moved around since then. But here we are back together again, and I think there've been so many connections made between all the different talks today. There are things that have sort of cropped up that people think, oh, that's amazing. But the prize, I think, goes to me. I'm going to claim a prize, and I don't care what you think. I'm going to claim a prize, which is that the gardens at Freddie Gifford's garden at Harlow was mentioned, and I've just become a trustee of that garden. So yay me! Anyway, you all don't want to listen to me, you want to listen to Karen. So over to you, Karen. She will take questions at the end. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, everyone. But can I check this is working, this device for a minute? So I'm Karen, and I am a member of Murray Edwards College. So I'm sort of very grateful for you to invite me here today to talk about Newnham. And I've learned a lot in the process of preparing for this talk. I've also quite recently written a book about women in the arts and crafts movement, and that's one of the reasons that I was invited to come and talk. There's quite a lot of similar themes that we're going to talk about during the course of the next half hour. I'd also just like to thank Laura and Frida. I'm not sure if they're here. They've probably gone home melting in the heat, but they've given me a lot of help in terms of looking at the archives and around the college as I got ready for today. So I don't have a prize to offer, but I have a quiz. So I grew up in a house that had William Morris curtains, sofa. I have decorated my own house, the bathroom actually, with a very beautiful Morris pattern. And I'm very curious to know how many people in the room either have Morris patterns in the room, have had during their childhood, have friends who have that, and are just generally familiar with Morris patterns in their home. Yeah, so quite a lot of us. So we're joined by sort of a common interest and a common joy. And William Morris was all about joy. He wanted joy in labour. He was really interested in, beautiful surroundings and how they affect us. So I've been invited to talk about the Morris wallpaper in the college, and you might think that that's a subject that's a little bit frivolous, but it really isn't. In truth, what it does is it helps us look through a window onto some of the most powerful cultural, artistic, and feminist movements in the early 19th and 20th centuries. The William Morris wallpaper designs that were used in the college are part of a much broader story, of both literal and metaphorical, about how women created space and how they used that to support their thoughts, their identities, and their self-expression. And it's a story how both aesthetics and intellect were interwoven at the very foundations of women's higher education. So I just need to work out how to move that. So this is what some of you may be familiar with if you know the college and if you've had a wander around today. So it's the corridors and the halls, quite literally, of the past, but also of the present. And as you walk through Newnham today, you pass these richly patterned walls, unmistakably Morris in style, and wallpapers that conjure up not just the flora and fauna of England, and it was England, it was the local flowers, but the fervour of a movement that sat behind it. And one of the things I want to talk to you about is how this aesthetic arrived here in Newnham, what it meant to the women who chose it, and how its presence in the college has evolved over the last, hundreds of years. So from its very earliest days, Newnham College, as I'm sure you've heard if you've been to some of the other talks today, embraced an architecture and interiors not simply as decoration, but as a declaration, a statement of purpose about how it wanted to present itself and its students to the world. In the earliest days of Newnham, ornate wallpapers, many but not all by William Morris and Company, adorned the walls of the student rooms. And these weren't merely aesthetic choices, as I said, they were part of a broader philosophy that beauty and art matters, that women's surroundings should reflect dignity, and that space can shape thought. Today, the wallpapers feature as a very distinctive background to college life, and I've been told by colleagues here that they're regarded with great fondness by students and alumni alike. Maybe not everybody, but a lot of people. And one former student, whose name might be familiar to you, Florence Ada Keyes, wrote in 1946 that after she left Newnham and got married, I clothed my house in William Morris wallpaper, which still remains in my dining room in very decent condition. And this wasn't just nostalgia, it was a sense of continuity. The paper on the wall wasn't just decoration, it was part of her intellectual inheritance. So when Newnham was first founded in the 1870s, and sorry if I'm telling some of you things that you already know, it wasn't just a bold educational experiment offering rigorous academic training to women, it was also an architectural and decorative one. Newnham Hall, now known as Old Hall, I think, was conceived in a style aligned with the arts and crafts movement and what we now call the Queen Anne revival. Elegant, unpretentious, domestic in tone, but with high artistic ambition. And there was a lot of press interest in the new women's colleges in Cambridge when they were first built, including how they were designed and decorated. In this 1877 article in the Graphic magazine, a journalist came to visit the college and was shown around by Miss Clough, the principal, who gave her a tour of inspection to include the studies of the students and the lecturers' little snuggeries, as they called them. The article describes the student room, which is illustrated in the middle, as furnished in the most fashionable style with sage green walls, turkey carpets and rugs, choice bits of china on little bookcases and tables. The walls are adorned with a bright watercolour sketch or two according to the taste of the occupant. But before the first hall was constructed, the first Newnham students lived with Miss Clough at 74 Regent Street in a house that had been let and furnished for them by Henry Sidgwick during the long vacation and using his own funds, so much so that he complained he wasn't able to go on holiday that year. And then for a couple of years, as the student body started to grow, they leased Merton Hall from St John's College. And in the meantime, Newnham Hall was being commissioned and built. One of these students was the 21-year-old Mary Paley, who I'm sure you all know went on to become the eminent economist. And she recalled that in Regent Street, there was an air of dutiful service as the students sat with Miss Clough in her sitting room and sewed the household linen, while Henry Sidgwick and Alfred Marshall talked to Miss Clough on both high subjects and lots of entertaining anecdotes. But these young women wanted to push boundaries, socially as well as in their education, and not everyone was thrilled about their taste for bold expression, particularly not Miss Clough. Mary Paley wryly remembered, the desire of our principal, Miss Clough, was that we should be as inconspicuous as possible, not only in behaviour, but also in appearance, in order to not to alarm the doubters. And incidentally, Alfred Marshall was one of those doubters, but he went on to marry Mary Paley later. Anyway, the students had other plans. They fully embraced the aesthetic revolution sweeping Britain in the late 1870s and adopted the new so-called pre-Raphaelite style of dress, and they were not shy about it. Mary wrote, "We trailed about in clinging robes of peacock blue, terracotta red, sage green or orange, feeling very brave and thoroughly enjoying the sensation it caused. Poor Miss Clough, her students were the observed of all observers." Wallpaper, dress and attitude became part of a shared aesthetic rebellion against the conformity and against invisibility. So Mary Paley is this lady here, and I think this is her great friend Jane Harrison. It might be that one. If Frida was here, she would correct me. But they were the greatest of friends, and after they moved together into Newnham Hall when it first opened in 1875, they too would sit together of an evening, embroidering their tennis frocks, and as they talked freely themselves on all sorts of subjects. Jane embroidered her dress with a pattern of pomegranates, and Mary hers with a pattern of Virginia creeper. Incidentally, also in this photo, so the lady on the far left is someone called Sarah Prideaux, who came up for a year in 1877, and she went on to become one of the first professional women bookbinders in Britain and a real authority on historic bookbindings, breaking into a field that traditionally excluded women. So there's still lots more stories to discover and tell from these early students. For some, pre-Raphaelite dress meant simply discarding the old-fashioned hoop crinolines and restrictive corsets of the age. But for others, as we've heard, it was a much more creative affair. There were no shops in Cambridge where women could buy ready-made dresses, and Liberty of London's dress department hadn't yet opened, although they sold dress fabrics in the fabulous colours and textures. Those were the days of high art, recalled student M.A. Wilcox, who had travelled from Boston to come up in 1880 and was one of the first residents of the newly built North Hall. And she remembered that in the early evenings, we had our feeble imitation of the Cambridge Union, or colourful dance. The vogue among the initiates was for the beautiful silks and velvets to be had from Liberty or the theatrical supply shop of Burnet. Instead of the prevailing fashions, we copied the long, graceful lines of costumes in old paintings. I do not expect to see such harmonies of colour and line again. So these first students were pioneers in all sorts of ways. They were, for the most part, women of mark, and therefore probably also experienced in fashionable decorative taste. And yet they had come up to Cambridge probably with a great deal of difficulty and determination for their academic futures. So in October 1875, Newnham Hall, or Old Hall as it is now called, opened. And the minutes of the building committee and council meetings from the college at that time only make quite general references to discussions about the internal decoration and lighting. But when they eventually moved into Newnham Hall, the students were allowed to choose wallpapers for their own rooms. So amongst those early arrivals, Jane Harrison and Mary Paley had their rooms papered with Morris papers. Jane chose a dark jasmine pattern, and Mary Paley had the same pattern, but in a lighter colourway. And you can see there's just a series of photographs from the archives here of rooms from different students in the period, but you can see that the furnishing, particularly on this one on the right, reflected fashionable or aesthetic trends. Wallpaper, of course, decorative rugs, bamboo furniture, parasols and fans, Japanese screens, ornaments on the mantelpiece, lots of flowers, and of course piles of books. And the tutor and the principal too were afforded this opportunity. And here are a couple of their rooms. And even the first library had a strongly patterned paper, which you can make out just at the back. And I'm sure Miss Clough had a hand in a lot of this approach to decoration. So those of you who were in the previous talk would have heard a little bit about Agnes Garrett and her sister Rhoda. And they were amongst the most influential figures behind at least one of Newnham's interiors. Agnes Garrett was a pioneering interior designer who, with her cousin Rhoda, was one of the first women to train in an architect's office. In 1874, they set up the first interior design company to be run by women in this country. And I think they were amongst the first entrepreneurial women in the world of design, establishing and running up their own business. I'm sorry. Oops. I guess I'm halfway through. Thought that was off. Apologies. So Agnes Garrett designed the study of her niece Philippa Fawcett, the brilliant mathematician who would later top the mathematical tripos. And here she is in her room at Newnham. And we know that Agnes was involved in this because an article in the Women's Herald in 1892 provides us with documentary evidence. There's just an important piece of information in a passing comment in an article about Newnham, but it's very significant because there's very little documented evidence of the interiors that the Garretts designed. And as we were just talking about earlier, and might talk a bit more later, about their involvement with the college, formally or otherwise. The article says that every student has a separate room which she can adorn to her heart's content. Miss Fawcett's study has been decorated by her aunt, Miss Agnes Garrett, the well-known art decorator. And this photograph of the room has only quite recently come to light and been matched with Philippa Fawcett and Agnes Garrett by Melissa Garrett, who did her PhD on that subject recently. It's a harmonious space, and there's even some speculation that the daybed at the back of the picture could have been one designed by her aunts. Now, this was interior design as ornamentation, not as ornamentation, but empowerment. Agnes and Rhoda had been resolved to pursue creative professional lives at a time when women were banned from being architects. They couldn't qualify until the 1880s. And that experience of being restricted in what they could do mirrored the experience of many women of their generation and the next. Rhoda, who came from a less wealthy branch of the family, was really frustrated by the limited options for women like her to earn a living, which she had to do, and remarked that she could almost count upon the fingers the number of employments in which women could engage in order to get their livelihood, which amounted in most cases to a mere pittance anyway. But the cousins became aware of a new firm, Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company, which was attracting a lot of attention, and saw in it a potential way to work independently, and which they went on to do very successfully and influentially by founding their own business, and through the publication of a very popular decorating advice book, which was illustrated with furnished rooms from their own home and studio in Gower Street. The same article in the Women's Herald continued, "It's difficult for us to now realise the courage which Miss Garrett and her cousin showed 18 years ago, when in 1871 they entered an architect's office and went through the complete course of 3 years' training in all the mysteries of drawing to scale, of designing as applied to houses, and even into the uninteresting minutiae of the construction of a drain or the laying of a gas pipe. It was hard, drudging work, but Miss Garrett has found that it has amply been repaid. In her offices at 2 Gower Street, she has trained a band of workmen and women upon whose labours she can implicitly rely. But she strongly objects, for instance, to selling a wallpaper alone, which pretty as it may be by itself, is really only one note in the harmonic home of a room or even a house. Curtains, drapery, and furniture should all be in accordance, for as Miss Garrett remarks, even a William Morris wallpaper may be vulgarised if the surroundings are not sympathetic. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who I'm sure you know was the first woman in Britain to qualify as a doctor, and Millicent Fawcett, leader of the suffrage movement, were part of the same family network. And their commitment to improving women's lives extended to how women lived and were cared for. From the 1870s, women's occupation of space, both literally and metaphorically, began to change and shift along with many societal norms, as did women's capacity to challenge long-held debates about gender in space and to ally the public and the private in the pursuit of their goals. Women were redefining space, not just occupying it, and this redefinition was as intellectual as it was decorative. Much of the space that women inhabited, in Newnham and beyond, was made possible by philanthropic efforts. Millicent Fawcett and her sister Elizabeth Garrett Anderson were both shareholders in the Ladies' Residential Chambers Company, co-founded in London by Agnes and Rhoda Garrett, as homes for independent working women. The Garretts established new women's institutions and hospitals, including the New Hospital for Women on the Euston Road in London, which opened in 1890 with 42 beds. It was founded by Elizabeth Garrett Anderson above a dispensary in Marylebone and was the first hospital in Britain with only medical women appointed to its staff. But if you look closely at the photos, you will also see Morris-like patterns on the bedspreads. Agnes and Rhoda undertook several commissions for homes and colleges across Cambridge, including another new discovery that I made just a few weeks ago. So this is hot off the press. I was in the university library looking through the estimate books for the local plumbing and maintenance firm of Grief and Company, which at the time was being run by a woman called Louisa Grief. And I found this reference, which you can see in the red box, to a commission for the decoration of rooms at Trinity Hall, as well as several references to plumbing, maintenance and repairs paid for by Miss Clough for the new buildings at Newnham. So even from the beginning, I think they had problems with the plumbing and the toilets. But Louisa Grief was there to save the day. Now, there's a lot of Cambridge connections. Agnes's nephew was at Trinity Hall. Her brother-in-law, Henry Fawcett, had been a very popular fellow there, but they predated this estimate. So I'm still trying to work out the connection with Trinity Hall, which this is from 1887. But I think there's a lot more to discover about the Garretts and their presence in Cambridge. The point I'm trying to make is that they weren't just decorators, they were activists, reformers, and thinkers. And just to go back to that Women's World article, they conclude that few have done more to advance the true and lasting interests of their sex than the four brilliantly gifted Garrett sisters. Miss Garrett, in her vocation of house decorator, shows the same thoroughness of purpose that has characterized her medical and political sisters. So William Morris and Agnes Garrett meet in that new generation of books that started to be published in the 1870s and 80s on interior decoration and how to fashionably furnish a home. The Garretts recommended Morris wallpapers in their book, although with the caveat described here. So you need to make the whole surroundings work. And Morris absolutely hated wallpaper on a ceiling and felt that it would box you in. And so that was definitely not something he advised. This book on the left is by Lucy Orensmith, called The Drawing Room and Its Decoration and Furniture of 1877. She worked for Morris and Company early on, and she also recommended Morris and Company papers. And the pattern on the left there, well, it's called Jessamine, but that's Jasmine. That's what Mary Paley and Jane Harrison chose in different colorways for their rooms. And the tastemaker Robert Edis also noted the general artistic excellence of Morris papers in his book, Decoration and Furniture of Townhouses in 1881, noting that they were the go-to choice for fashionable and artistic and intellectual sets in London. So I've just, thanks to Laura, have a few slides of the papers that were known to have been used in Newnham rooms, either in the earliest days or some of them subsequently. These are all very well-known patterns. Daisy was the very first pattern, or the first of two patterns that Morris designed. And they're all very beautiful and classic and come in lots and lots of colorways. But there's another thing that they all have in common, which I noted while I was just looking at them for this talk. They're all included in the same wallpaper sample book of Morris papers, and all designed between the period 1862 and 1882. And the V&A has one of these sample books in its collection. During Morris's lifetime, his company produced approximately 70 wallpaper patterns in different colorways and finishes. Morris himself designed 50 of these, and about 16 were by a handful of other designers working for the firm. By the 1860s, wallpaper, which was known at that time as paper hangings, were in widespread use, facilitated by technical changes and enabled large quantities to be printed by roller machines. And the newly founded Morris Marshall Faulkner and Company decided to introduce wallpaper into its range as an item of off-the-peg production. It was in wallpaper design that Morris first achieved his mastery of flat repeating pattern, stating later that printing patterns on paper for wall hangings was quite a modern and very humble, but as things go, useful art. The firm only ever added a few patterns to its range every year, But from the 1870s onwards, and therefore coinciding with the founding of Newnham College and its building programme, wallpapers are an important component of its output. Morris also, he didn't sell many in the 1860s, but in the 1870s, they also developed a very strong marketing strategy and significantly expanded the wallpaper range, which went on sale at their new shop on Oxford Street, which opened in 1877. Decorators, customers, and window shoppers could see the wallpapers displayed to good effect alongside other goods in the Morris style. And by 1879, there were 32 patterns and 125 different colorings or effects to choose from. So I've been speculating a little bit about how the women of Newnham would have been facilitated in choosing their wallpapers for their new rooms. They could well have been familiar with the Morris and Company shop on Oxford Street, or the firm may have sent a sample book up to Cambridge, or it could be that Basil Champney or Agnes and Rhoda Garrett facilitated the procurement of the wallpapers for their rooms if they worked together. And then when decorator and art worker Frederick Leach established his own shop in St Mary's Passage in 1880, he advertised paper hangings from the best English houses. It's not known whether these included Morris and Company papers, but given his existing relationship as a subcontractor undertaking work for the firm, it's a possibility. So if you don't know Leach, I'm sure you know the David Parr House, but also Leach decorated many of the colleges and churches in Cambridge. I've also come across some more evidence, this time in the college account books, that Leach undertook decorating work at Newnham. You may already have known that, but I was very excited to see it. And you can hopefully see from the entry that Leach was paid for the painting and decorating of North Hall in 1882. And then when the new dining room was built, it was originally furnished with the Sussex chairs made by Morris and Company. And these chairs are now iconic, but at the time they represented a really radical, deliberate and modern choice for the college when they were new. And the same chairs, maybe you've noticed as well, but they were later purchased in bulk by Sidney Cockrell, director of the Fitzwilliam Museum, to be used in the galleries there. But these early days were the glory days. The college expanded, and according to student K.M. Dixon, who came up in 1880, there was no Morris wallpaper in North Hall, just plain plaster walls. She remembered another student, Maggie Cobden, wearing a pre-Raphaelite dress, coming in to see her and looking at the wall and saying, "Oh, how beautiful." And then just briefly, because I've still got a few more things to say, this is an interesting comparison. More or less the same date, the new dining hall of Balliol College in Oxford, which just shows the deliberate choices and the move away from the sort of traditional Gothic college architecture that was being introduced here. In 1875, Jemima Clough was asked why women should leave home at all to study, and her answer is almost prophetic of another quote about having a room of one's own. A woman can study with much less mental strain in a place where all the arrangements of the house are made to suit the hours of study, where she can have undisturbed possession of one room, and where she can have access to any books that she may need. So the students loved having their own room and their own spaces. But while that continued, the decoration and the tastes began to change. And as I said, not everyone always loved the William Morris paper. And another student from the 1920s reflected, "I had my first year in a scholars' room on the ground floor of Clough Hall. It was papered with Morris's daisy, one of his earliest patterns. I learned from my elders and betters to make a hardship of this, because in 1926, Morris papers were absolutely out of fashion." It's telling, though, that the wallpaper was still there and still shaping the atmosphere of the colleagues. Now, just briefly, and before we get sort of too comfortable with the idea of Newnham leading the way, there are quite a few other colleges were also embracing artistic interiors, and some of them using Morris wallpapers. A recent conservation project at Peterhouse in Cambridge uncovered these layers of wallpaper beneath the plaster in one of the students' rooms. And I feel slightly happy about this. This design, Mallow, was designed by Kate Faulkner, the first woman behind Morris & Company's designs. I probably didn't know that, but it makes me feel quite nice to think that. And then the photo on the left is a student college room in St. John's, just to show that there were male students were also interested in creating aesthetic interiors as sites of scholarship, comfort, and personal identity. But that's a whole other talk, and we don't have time for that today. And I'd just like to return, as I close, to the idea of aesthetic interiors being deeply tied to the changing role of women in public life. Through philanthropy and design, women found ways to enter and reshape the public realm. And of course, the founding and building of Newnham is also the product of extraordinary philanthropy, vision, and drive by a whole group of people. But this is what some scholars have called missionary aestheticism, a belief that improving the material conditions in life through beauty and order was itself a moral good. It gave women a powerful platform in both domestic and civic design. And these student rooms, well, they were often the first spaces where young women could be entirely themselves. Marion Pick, student in 1887, wrote, "To a first year on arrival, 2 private rooms were unspeakable bliss. I simply sat and looked and loved it all." And there we have to end for today. But I just hope that, I'm showing this slide with apologies to Professor Mary Beard. I hope she's not in the room. But I also hope that everyone enjoys the visual comparison of rooms then and now. The serious point behind this, and it's just a bit of fun, but the importance of the physical environment and of domestic provision at Newnham have been at the centre of a vision for the college from the outset. The rooms for students and tutors alike are proof, I think, that interior design and intellect are not opposites but allies, a theme that it could be argued continues even to this day. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.